July 4th, 1963. Independence Day in Harlem. 300 families were gathering in Marcus Garvey Park for the biggest community celebration of the year. Children played on swings, fathers grilled hot dogs, mothers spread blankets on the grass. It was supposed to be a day of joy, unity, and pride. What nobody knew, except for one barber who'd overheard the wrong conversation at the wrong time, was that at exactly 3:15 p.m., when the park was most crowded, a coordinated attack would turn the celebration into a massacre. 12 gunmen positioned around the park perimeter, military-grade weapons hidden in vendor booths, escape routes planned down to the second. The goal wasn't just to kill Bumpy Johnson, it was to destroy the heart of Harlem itself, by slaughtering 300 innocent people who'd gathered to celebrate their community. But at 2:47 p.m., just 28 minutes before the attack was scheduled to begin, something unprecedented happened. The park began to empty. Not in panic, not in chaos, but in quiet, organized waves as word spread through the crowd. Family emergency. Everyone needs to go home now. By 3:15 p.m., Marcus Garvey Park was empty except for 12 confused gunmen who found themselves targeting nobody but each other. But how does one barber's conversation save 300 lives? How do you evacuate a crowded park without creating panic or revealing the threat? And what did Bumpy Johnson's warning system teach everyone about the difference between community leadership and criminal authority? The answer reveals something about loyalty that goes beyond money or fear. Sometimes the most powerful network isn't the one built by crime bosses. It's the one built by ordinary people who decide to protect each other. To understand how one overheard conversation prevented the largest massacre in Harlem's history, you need to understand why the Colombo crime family thought they could succeed where Chicago, Detroit, and Boston had all failed. Joseph Joe Colombo was 40 years old in 1963, head of one of New York's 5 crime families, and absolutely convinced that the time had come to eliminate Bumpy Johnson permanently. Unlike other crime bosses who tried to negotiate or intimidate, Colombo believed that Bumpy's power came from his connection to the Harlem community. Colombo had studied every previous attempt to eliminate or control Bumpy Johnson, analyzing why Sam Giancana, Frank Costello, and other powerful crime figures had failed to break his influence. The pattern was clear. Bumpy's strength wasn't his criminal organization or his financial resources, it was the loyalty of ordinary citizens who saw him as their protector and advocate. "You want to kill a king?" Colombo told his lieutenants during a planning meeting at his social club in Brooklyn. "You don't just eliminate the man, you destroy everything he represents. You make his people understand that following him leads to death, that their loyalty brings catastrophe to their families." Colombo's strategy was brutal and comprehensive, designed to accomplish what no previous attack had achieved: the complete destruction of community support that made Bumpy untouchable. The Independence Day celebration would draw hundreds of families to Marcus Garvey Park. Mothers, children, elderly grandparents, teenagers, everyone who made Harlem what it was. A coordinated attack during the peak of the celebration would kill dozens of innocent people and wound hundreds more. The massacre would be blamed on a gang war gone wrong. Federal investigators would flood the neighborhood with armed agents and surveillance equipment, and the survivors would learn through brutal experience that associating with Bumpy Johnson brought deadly consequences to their families and children. After July 4th, Colombo explained to his assembled soldiers, "Nobody in Harlem will want to be anywhere near Bumpy Johnson. His community support will disappear overnight. Parents won't let their children play on streets where he operates. Business owners won't accept his protection. Politicians won't take his calls. He'll become a pariah in his own neighborhood." The plan had been developed over 6 months with military precision. 12 experienced shooters positioned at strategic points around the park. Weapons smuggled in through legitimate vendor booths. Communication equipment to coordinate the attack. Emergency medical teams on standby to treat the shooters if they were wounded during the operation. But Colombo made one crucial mistake in his planning. He assumed that criminal conversations were only dangerous when heard by law enforcement or rival organizations. He never considered that ordinary citizens might be listening, understanding, and capable of acting on information that could save lives. July 2nd, 1963, 2:30 p.m. Abraham Honest Abe Washington was cutting hair at his barber shop on 225th Street when 2 men he'd never seen before walked in and sat down in the waiting area. Abe Washington had owned Washington's Barber Shop for 15 years. It was a neighborhood institution, the kind of place where men came not just for haircuts, but for conversation, community news, and the comfortable atmosphere of a business owned by someone who'd been part of Harlem longer than most of his customers had been alive. Abe was 52 years old, a Korean War veteran who'd returned home to Harlem in 1953 and used his GI Bill benefits to learn barbering, but his military service hadn't been typical infantry duty. Sergeant Abraham Washington had served with the 8th Army's Military Intelligence Battalion, specializing in intercepting and analyzing enemy communications. During 18 months of combat operations, Abe had learned to listen to conversations in multiple languages, identify coded communications, and extract tactical information from discussions that were designed to hide their real meaning. He'd saved American lives by understanding that casual conversations between captured enemy soldiers often contained crucial intelligence about planned attacks. When he returned to Harlem and opened his barber shop, Abe had deliberately chosen a profession that allowed him to listen without being noticed. He genuinely enjoyed cutting hair and serving his community, but part of him remained the intelligence specialist who understood that important information often came from conversations that people didn't realize were being overheard. He was known throughout the neighborhood as someone who listened more than he talked, who gave good advice when asked, and who treated every customer, from teenage boys getting their first professional haircut to elderly men who'd been coming to him for decades, with exactly the same respect and attention. The two strangers who entered his shop that afternoon looked like businessmen, expensive suits, well-groomed, carrying briefcases that suggested they were involved in some kind of professional work. But Abe's trained eye noticed details that civilian customers wouldn't see. The way they positioned themselves to observe the street while appearing to read magazines, the bulges under their jackets that suggested concealed weapons, the careful way they spoke to each other in voices just low enough to avoid being easily overheard. They sat quietly in the waiting area, occasionally checking their watches, apparently waiting for someone to join them. Ebo was focused on his current customer, Mrs. Henderson's 12-year-old grandson, who was getting his hair cut for a family wedding, when a third man entered the shop. This man was different from the first two, older, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to giving orders rather than receiving them. "Gentlemen," the older man said quietly, "we need to discuss the Independence Day situation." Ibby continued cutting hair, keeping his expression neutral and professional. In 15 years of running a barber shop, he'd learned that customers sometimes had private conversations while waiting, and the key to maintaining a successful business was treating those conversations as if they were happening in a different room entirely. But what Abe heard over the next 20 minutes would haunt him for the rest of his life. The three men spoke in the careful, coded language that criminals use when they think they're safe from surveillance. But Abe Washington was a Korean War veteran who'd served in military intelligence. He'd been trained to listen to conversations, identify patterns, and extract information from discussions that were designed to hide their real meaning. "The park situation is confirmed for the holiday," the older man said. 12 positions, multiple entry points, coordinated timing. The target will be there, along with his usual community support. "What about collateral issues?" asked one of the younger men. "Collateral issues are part of the strategy," the older man replied. "The more comprehensive the demonstration, the more effective the message will be." Abe's hands continued cutting hair with practiced precision, but his mind was racing. These men were discussing some kind of attack plan for Independence Day. The park situation could only refer to the community celebration that was being organized for Marcus Garvey Park, and collateral issues in criminal terminology meant innocent casualties. "Timeline?" asked the second younger man. "Peak attendance, maximum impact. 3:15 p.m. The vendor positions will be established by noon. Communication equipment tested by 2 p.m. All positions confirmed by 3 p.m. Abe finished the boy's haircut, accepted payment from Mrs. Henderson, and began cleaning his tools with the slow, methodical movements of someone trying not to attract attention to himself. The older man continued speaking. "After the demonstration, federal response will be immediate and overwhelming. The target's community support will evaporate once people understand the consequences of association. Within 6 months, the organization will collapse from internal isolation." The three men stood up, shook hands, and left the barber shop without ever acknowledging Abe's presence. They'd conducted their planning meeting in what they assumed was a safe location, never considering that the barber cutting hair 10 feet away was a military veteran capable of understanding exactly what they were planning. July 2nd, 1963, 4:15 p.m. Abe Washington closed his barber shop early and walked 3 blocks to Small's Paradise, where he asked to speak privately with Illinois Gordon, one of Bumpy Johnson's most trusted lieutenants. "Mr. Gordon," Abe said quietly, "I need to talk to someone about something I heard this afternoon. Something about Independence Day that I think Bumpy needs to know." Illinois Gordon studied Abe's expression and immediately understood that this wasn't a casual conversation. "What kind of something, Abe?" "The kind that involves 12 positions, peak attendance, and maximum impact at 3:15 p.m. on July 4th. Illinois Gordon felt ice water in his veins. "Come with me, Abe. Right now." 20 minutes later, Abe Washington was sitting across from Bumpy Johnson in the private office above Small's Paradise, recounting word for word the conversation he'd overheard in his barber shop. Bumpy listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details or timing. When Abe finished his report, Bumpy sat quietly for several minutes, processing the implications of what he'd just heard. "Hey," Bumpy said finally, "how certain are you about what these men were planning?" "Certain enough to close my shop and walk over here to tell you about it," Abe replied. "Mr. Johnson, I spent 2 years in Korea listening to enemy communications and trying to prevent American soldiers from walking into ambushes. Those men this afternoon were planning an ambush. A big one, and it's aimed at anyone who's going to be in Marcus Garvey Park on Independence Day." Bumpy nodded slowly. "How many people you think will be at that celebration?" "Maybe 300. Families with kids, elderly folks, teenagers. Basically everybody in the neighborhood who wants to celebrate the holiday together." Bumpy's expression hardened. "All right, what you just told me means that someone is planning to murder 300 innocent people to get to me. That's not a criminal operation. That's terrorism." The word hung in the air between them. Terrorism wasn't a term commonly used in 1963, but it perfectly described what Colombo was planning: the deliberate targeting of civilians to achieve political goals through fear. "What are you gonna do?" Webb asked. Bumpy's answer revealed something about his character that separated him from every other crime boss in the country. "I'm gonna make sure those 300 people stay alive. But I'm gonna do it in a way that doesn't create panic or destroy the community celebration they're looking forward to." July 3rd, 1963. Bumpy Johnson began implementing the most sophisticated emergency response operation in Harlem's history. The challenge was enormous. Evacuate 300 people from a public park without revealing the threat, without creating panic, and without destroying the community's faith in their ability to gather safely for celebrations. Bumpy's solution was elegant in its simplicity. He would use the same community network that made him powerful to spread a coordinated message that would empty the park peacefully. Starting at 6 a.m. on July 4th, trusted community members began receiving phone calls with identical messages. "There's been a family emergency in the Johnson household. Out of respect, the Independence Day celebration is being moved to a smaller private gathering. Please spread the word quietly. We don't want to upset the children, but everyone should stay home with their families today." The message was perfect because it was believable, respectful, and actionable. People weren't being told there was danger. They were being told there was a family situation that required consideration for others. The celebration wasn't being canceled. It was being moved to a more appropriate setting. Mrs. Washington, who ran the newsstand on 35th Street, called 12 families and asked them to quietly pass the message to their neighbors. Reverend Thompson from Abyssinian Baptist Church made 15 phone calls to church members who he knew would spread the word through their extended families. Mr. Rodriguez, who owned the grocery store on Lenox Avenue, mentioned the change of plans to every customer who came in that morning. By 10 a.m., the message had reached over 200 families. By noon, virtually everyone who'd been planning to attend the celebration had heard about the family emergency and the request to stay home out of respect. The genius of Bumpy's strategy was that it relied on the same community bonds that Colombo was trying to destroy. People didn't question the message because it came from neighbors they trusted. They didn't demand explanations because the request was framed in terms of showing respect for someone else's difficult situation. July 4th, 1963, 2:45 p.m. Marcus Garvey Park was nearly empty. A few joggers, a couple of elderly men playing chess, several children on the playground with their parents. maybe 30 people total, scattered across an area that should have held 300. At 2:50 p.m., Illinois Gordon and three of Bumpy's most experienced soldiers positioned themselves at strategic points around the park, not to engage in combat, but to observe and document whatever was about to happen. At 3:15 p.m., exactly as scheduled, 12 men emerged from concealed positions around the park perimeter. They were carrying military-style weapons and wearing communication equipment that allowed them to coordinate their movements. For 30 seconds, the gunmen looked around in confusion, trying to understand where their targets had gone. They'd been planning for months to attack a crowd of 300 people, and instead they found themselves in a nearly empty park with no clear targets and no way to accomplish their mission. At 3:16 p.m., the gunmen began receiving radio communications from their command center, asking why the operation hadn't begun. The response was visible frustration and confusion as the shooters tried to explain that their targets had somehow disappeared. At 3:18 p.m., the gunmen began retreating to their predetermined escape routes, abandoning an operation that had become meaningless without the civilian casualties that were supposed to terrorize the community. Illinois Gordon and his team documented everything from a safe distance, taking photographs and noting details that would be useful if law enforcement ever needed evidence of the planned attack. By 3:30 p.m., Marcus Garvey Park was quiet again, except for a few confused joggers who wondered why there seemed to be so many well-dressed men walking quickly toward the subway entrances. July 4th, 1963, 6:00 p.m. Word began spreading through Harlem that the Independence Day celebration had been quietly moved and that everyone was safe. But the real story, the story of how Abraham Washington's careful listening had prevented a massacre, remained known only to a small group of people who understood the importance of keeping certain information confidential. The success of the evacuation operation demonstrated something unprecedented in organized crime history. A criminal leader had chosen to protect innocent civilians rather than use them as shields or weapons against his enemies. Bumpy Johnson had sacrificed tactical advantage and personal safety to ensure that families could return to their normal lives without ever knowing how close they'd come to tragedy. In the days following July 4th, federal investigators began receiving anonymous tips about suspicious activity around Marcus Garvey Park. Photographs of armed men, descriptions of coordinated movements, and detailed reports about planned violence that had somehow been prevented. The FBI launched a quiet investigation that eventually led to several arrests, though the full scope of Colombo's planned massacre was never made public. Abraham Washington returned to his barber shop the next morning and never spoke publicly about what he'd overheard or what his warning had accomplished. He continued cutting hair, listening to conversations, and serving his community for another 25 years before retiring in 1988. Customers often commented that Abe seemed particularly attentive to conversations, as if he was always listening for something important. But he never explained that his attention came from understanding that civilian lives could depend on information that people thought was safely private. Joseph Colombo never attempted another attack on Harlem civilians. The failure of the Independence Day operation convinced him that Bumpy Johnson's community connections were too deep and too sophisticated to overcome through terrorist tactics. More importantly, Colombo realized that attacking innocent families had transformed him from a criminal competitor into something far more dangerous, a threat to children and grandparents who had no involvement in organized crime activities. The families who'd stayed home on July 4th eventually learned that their decision had been based on more than just respect for a family emergency. But they also learned something more important when their community leaders asked them to trust a message they couldn't fully explain. That trust had saved their lives. Bumpy Johnson had proven something that redefined community leadership forever. Real power isn't about controlling people through fear or intimidation. It's about building relationships strong enough that people will act on faith when their safety depends on it. Abraham Washington had proven something equally important about civic responsibility. Ordinary citizens who pay attention, understand what they're hearing, and take action when necessary can prevent tragedies that law enforcement never sees coming. July 4th, 1963. The day 300 people stayed home because a barber understood that some conversations are too dangerous to ignore. The day Bumpy Johnson proved that the strongest weapon against terrorism isn't violence. It's community trust strong enough that people will act on incomplete information when their neighbors ask them to. The day Abraham Washington demonstrated that ordinary people doing ordinary jobs can become heroes simply by listening carefully and acting courageously when they overhear something that threatens innocent lives. Joseph Colombo learned that attacking communities requires more than military planning. It requires understanding how communities communicate, how trust operates, and how quickly information can spread through networks that criminals can't see or control. 12 gunmen positioned around an empty park. 300 families safe in their homes. One barber who understood that some conversations change everything. The massacre that never happened became a story that was never told publicly, but was never forgotten by the people who understood what almost occurred and what prevented it. Abraham Washington continued cutting hair and listening to conversations for 25 more years. He never again overheard anything as dangerous as the Independence Day planning meeting, but he never stopped paying attention to what his customers said when they thought nobody was listening. Because sometimes the difference between tragedy and safety is one person who's willing to listen carefully and act courageously when innocent lives are threatened. July 4th, 1963, Independence Day in Harlem. The day freedom meant staying home, safety meant trusting your neighbors, and heroism meant a barber who understood that some conversations are too important to ignore. 300 lives saved by one overheard conversation and a community network built on something stronger than fear. The understanding that protecting each other is everyone's responsibility. The gunmen retreated to Brooklyn and never returned to Harlem. The families eventually learned why their quiet Independence Day had been the most important celebration of their lives. And Abraham Washington kept cutting hair, listening carefully, and proving that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they understand that paying attention to the right conversation at the right moment can save entire communities. That's the power of community. Not the power to hurt people, but the power to protect them. Not the power to create fear, but the power to create safety through trust, communication, and the willingness to act when action is needed most. Abraham Washington wasn't a criminal, a soldier, or a community leader. He was a barber who listened carefully and cared enough to act on what he heard. Sometimes that's all it takes to prevent a tragedy and save 300 lives.